some truths are better left undiscovered. When Malcolm, a devoted father from a quiet town in Pennsylvania, started noticing unsettling similarities between his 8-year-old son and his younger brother, the ground beneath him began to crack. What began as a fleeting discomfort turned into a deep vortex of suspicion, memory, and doubt. Could his wife, the woman he trusted most, have committed the ultimate betrayal? Or was it all just fear and guilt playing tricks on his mind? Before we dive into this tense, deeply human journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we explore stories that go to the heart of the dilemmas no one wants to face, and that maybe live inside us all. That Sunday, sunlight filtered through the porch windows with a gentleness that made everything feel almost too perfect to be real. The scent of pancakes and maple syrup still lingered in the air, and Silas's laughter, freshly 8 years old, filled the gaps between the familiar morning sounds. Malcolm Ridgway watched the scene with a kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes from stability. Avery clearing plates, Silas building a makeshift castle from cereal boxes. For a moment, everything seemed exactly where it should be. It was only when Jude arrived, fashionably late and wearing that half-hearted smile, that Malcolm felt a twinge in his ribs. Not pain. Something subtler, like a single note out of tune that everyone else missed, but not him. Jude had always been that way. Arriving on his own time, saying whatever came to mind, and somehow always being forgiven. There was a lightness in him that, by contrast, made Malcolm seem even more serious. During breakfast, Silas excitedly insisted on showing his uncle a new card trick. Malcolm watched the interaction with his elbows on the table, coffee cooling in the mug between his hands. And then he saw it, a smile. Small, spontaneous, the kind that can't be forced. Silas smiled at Jude with the exact same curl at the corner of the mouth that Jude had since childhood. Malcolm blinked, tried to brush it off. Kids copy expressions from adults, he thought. Familiarity, imitation, nothing unusual. But the image stuck, and in the days that followed, it returned. Like a drop of water hitting the same spot of wood again and again, Silas crossing his arms in a way that looked just like Jude. The way he raised an eyebrow when confused. Tiny details, almost invisible. Avery, unaware, carried on with her routine. A practical, warm woman with a laugh that could dissolve any argument. When Malcolm brought up the similarities, she chuckled. They adore each other. Of course, Silas is picking up some of Jude's quirks. It was natural. Of course it was. But the planted thought kept growing, and with it, memories returned. Before the marriage, Avery and Jude had been close. Very close. Malcolm remembered the time with a vague unease. Hushed laughter in the kitchen when he got home late. Silences that felt like something was being held back. There were no confrontations, no proof. Just a sense that something had once happened. And then, as if nothing had, life moved on. They married, had Silas. Jude pulled away, as if recognizing an invisible boundary. But now, with the days bleeding into routine and Silas growing into himself, Malcolm started to wonder if the past had ever really been buried. Because more and more, in the little things, he was beginning to see Jude's face in his son. It started with the drawer in the hallway. Malcolm had been looking for a replacement battery, nothing more. But instead, he found a stack of old photos, glossy reminders of a time before Silas, before the mortgage and routines. In most of them, it was the three of them, Avery, Jude, and himself. But the way Avery looked at Jude in one particular shot, caught mid-laugh, her hand resting on his shoulder, made Malcolm pause. That moment had been at a New Year's party, years before the wedding. Malcolm remembered it now with uncomfortable clarity. He had arrived late from a shift at the hospital, and the two of them had already been drinking wine. That night, Jude had made a joke that only Avery understood. An inside reference that left Malcolm feeling like the outsider in his own relationship. Back then, he told himself it was just friendship. They were close, maybe too close, but it was nothing. And yet the unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of a photograph. As the week wore on, Malcolm found himself fixated on these fragments. Avery humming in the kitchen to a song Jude used to love, her quiet smile when Malcolm mentioned his brother's name, even her reaction to Silas's habits, overly dismissive, as if brushing off a truth she didn't want to confront. Around that time, Avery's cousin, Lila, came to visit. She was energetic, curious, always asking questions. When her short visit turned into a few weeks, Malcolm noticed how easily she integrated into their routine, picking Silas up from school, helping Avery with meals, joining them on weekend outings. One evening, after a wine-fueled dinner, Lila leaned in and whispered, "I always thought Avery and Jude had some strange chemistry. Guess I was wrong." Malcolm smiled politely, but felt his stomach tighten. A few days later, Lila found an old wooden box in the attic. Inside were scattered mementos, postcards, matchbooks, and a small envelope with Jude's name on it. It contained a single photograph of Jude and Avery sitting by a campfire, heads leaned in. On the back, scribbled in blue ink, was, "For that night and what it meant." Lila hesitated, then brought it to Malcolm. "This doesn't mean anything, right?" she asked softly. He began testing the edges of memory. Casual questions, subtle references. "You remember that cabin trip we took with Jude, before we were married?" he asked one night while washing dishes. Avery glanced at him, then back to the sink. "Of course. Why?" "No reason," Malcolm replied, but she hadn't looked at him when she answered. At work, he found it hard to concentrate. His mind wandered through timelines, matching the dates of his long ER shifts to the months before Silas was born. There were gaps, moments when he wasn't there, when things could have happened, or maybe nothing happened at all. Then came the plumber, a new guy the repair company sent. Malcolm watched him work on the basement sink. The man was in his early 30s, average build, nothing remarkable, until he turned and reached for a wrench. On the side of his neck, just beneath the ear, Malcolm noticed a birthmark. It was crescent-shaped, reddish-brown, identical to one Silas had behind his knee. The coincidence was so strange, Malcolm felt dizzy. He didn't say anything, just stood there, heart thudding, watching the man tighten a pipe like it was any other Tuesday. The worst part wasn't knowing. It was not knowing what he was supposed to be seeing. Was he reading into glances that meant nothing? Was the fear itself the betrayal? He needed clarity, or closure, or something in between. But the past had a way of hiding just beyond the reach of certainty, and lately it felt like it was starting to bleed into the present. It was Silas's way of sitting on the porch steps, elbows resting on knees, hands loosely clasped, eyes scanning the horizon, that unsettled Malcolm most. It was exactly how Jude used to sit when they were boys. Not just similar, identical. He watched from inside the house, coffee in hand, a tightness growing in his chest. The boy didn't know he was being watched. He was just being himself, or who he thought he was. Later that evening, Malcolm found a sketchbook Silas had left open on the living room floor. He knelt and flipped through it. Among the superheroes and dragons, one drawing stopped him. It was a man holding a boy's hand. The figures were labeled me and Dad, but the man's face, the jawline, the nose, it looked more like Jude than himself. Malcolm stared at it for a long time. When he asked Silas about it that night, the boy shrugged. "I just drew it how I saw it in my head." He tried to dismiss it, again, but the feeling didn't fade. In fact, it sharpened. At dinner, Avery laughed at something Silas said, and Jude laughed at the exact same moment, with the exact same cadence. A split second too synchronized, too intimate. Malcolm looked at them across the table. Avery's hand grazed Jude's wrist as she passed the breadbasket. He couldn't say if it was intentional, but Jude didn't flinch. Neither did she. And then they looked at each other. For just a moment. Malcolm swallowed hard. "You two really are in sync," he said, attempting levity. Jude looked down. Avery smiled too quickly. "It's just family," she said. "Of course," Malcolm murmured, the words hollow in his mouth. That night, lying awake, he went over the dinner again in his mind. Every glance, every gesture. Was he losing perspective? Seeing things that weren't there? Or had he ignored something that had always been in plain sight? He didn't know what frightened him more. The idea that they had shared something once, or that maybe they still did. The smile, the drawing, the look. Some expressions, he realized, can't be invented. Not by children. And not by adults pretending there's nothing between them. Malcolm began to chart the coincidences like a detective too afraid to name the crime. He made mental notes of glances exchanged, the tone of voices, who sat where during meals. His behavior shifted. Not overtly, but enough for Lila to notice. One evening, while helping Malcolm set the table, Lila spoke softly. "You're watching them. Every move. Every word." Malcolm didn't deny it. "Wouldn't you?" Lila hesitated. "Maybe, but you're looking for something you may not want to find. That night, Malcolm couldn't sleep. He slipped out of bed and quietly retrieved the envelope with the photo Lila had found. He stared at the message, for that night and what it meant, as if it might rearrange itself into something more innocent. But it never did. He began to wonder if Silas himself had questions. The boy had become more curious lately, asking about old family stories and where babies come from. One morning at breakfast, he looked up and asked, "Dad, did Uncle Jude ever live with us?" Malcolm blinked. "No," Silas shrugged. "I had a dream about it. It felt real." That same afternoon, the plumber returned. Something about a follow-up inspection. Malcolm made small talk, feigning casual interest. "You ever do work at 214 Oak Ridge?" he asked, referring to Jude's old place. The man wiped his hands on a rag. "Years ago, I think so. That little yellow house, right?" "Yeah," Malcolm said quietly. When the man left, Malcolm's stomach knotted. He told himself it meant nothing, just a contractor doing rounds. But the coincidences were too perfectly timed, too sharp. Later that week, Lila found a torn notebook page under the couch cushions. It was clearly Avery's handwriting. It read, "If it ever comes out, we lose everything. I thought we could just go on, pretend, for Silas, for Malcolm. But I'm scared he knows." She brought it to Malcolm without a word. His hands trembled as he read it. He didn't confront Avery. Not yet. Instead, he watched her that evening. How she tucked Silas into bed. How she kissed Malcolm goodnight. How her eyes lingered on him just a moment too long. Maybe the note was old. Maybe it wasn't even about Jude. But the spiral was tightening. That night, Malcolm finally opened his laptop and started researching private DNA kits. He ordered one. When it arrived 3 days later, he stared at the box for hours before locking it in his desk drawer, unopened. He wasn't sure if he was preparing for the truth or protecting himself from it. The DNA kit sat untouched, like a landmine in the drawer. Malcolm began avoiding the room altogether, as if proximity might force his hand. Lila, sensing the rising tension, became more involved with Silas, taking him on outings, bringing home crafts and puzzles. Her presence, once light, now felt necessary, a buffer between the adults. One evening, Malcolm found himself talking to her more than usual. She listened, not with judgment, but with something gentler, understanding. "Do you ever wonder if knowing is worse than not knowing?" he asked. Lila tilted her head. "Sometimes the questions keep us sane. It's the answers that break us." Avery walked in moments later, catching the end of the exchange. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything okay in here?" "Just talking," Malcolm said, a little too quickly. That night, as Avery folded laundry, Malcolm watched her carefully. She moved with habitual grace, but something about her quietness unnerved him. "I found a note," he said finally. She didn't stop folding. "What kind of note?" He paused. "Yours, under the couch, about pretending, about me and Silas." Now she froze. Her fingers tightened around a towel. But when she turned to him, her expression was unreadable. "That was from years ago. Right after Silas was born, I was overwhelmed, afraid, but not of what you think." "Then tell me what I should think." Avery hesitated. "I won't lie to you, Malcolm, but not everything has a clear answer. Some things are better left unspoken." He almost asked if it was Jude, if something had happened, but instead he stood there in silence, her words echoing. Down the hall, Silas laughed at something Lila said, and Malcolm wondered if truth always had to come wrapped in certainty, or if sometimes doubt was all you could live with. It was during one of Lila's longer walks with Silas that Malcolm found himself alone with Jude. The conversation started casual, weather, work, a game they both half-watched on mute, but quickly turned heavier. Jude sipped his beer and stared at the floor. "You've been different lately." Malcolm didn't answer. Jude added, "If there's something you need to ask me, just ask it." Malcolm studied him. "Would you tell me the truth?" Jude met his eyes. "If I thought you were ready for it." There it was. Not a denial, but a riddle. They sat in silence for a moment. Malcolm noticed how Jude's eyes shifted away too quickly, how his leg bounced with a rhythm he didn't seem to control. These were signs he knew from childhood. Jude, anxious under pressure. "Why'd you stop coming by so often after Silas was born?" Malcolm asked, testing. Jude looked surprised. "I figured you needed space. A new baby. You were building a family." "That's not all," Malcolm said. Jude's voice dropped. "Maybe not." The ambiguity was unbearable. Malcolm wanted to scream, to shake the truth out of him. Instead, he got up, mumbled something about needing air, and left. That evening, Malcolm found himself in the hallway mirror, searching for himself in his son's reflection. Silas passed behind him, humming a tune Malcolm didn't recognize, but Jude used to sing it. Later, while helping Silas get ready for bed, Malcolm saw the mark again. That crescent birthmark behind Silas's knee. He remembered the plumber, and then for the first time, a memory he had buried. Avery once joking about her type, and she had described the plumber's exact build. The thought came uninvited. What if it's not Jude? What if it was someone else? Someone I never even considered. A pattern started forming that scared him more than any one truth. That night, Malcolm sat outside on the porch. Lila joined him after Silas had gone to sleep. They didn't talk much until Lila said, "You know, it could be neither." Malcolm turned to her. "What do you mean?" "Maybe it wasn't Jude. Maybe it wasn't anyone close. Maybe the truth is more ordinary than the pain you've imagined." He wanted to believe that, but he'd seen too much. Or maybe just enough to see everything in fragments. Lila watched him for a moment. Sometimes it's easier to focus on the mystery than to face what's broken. Maybe you and Avery have more distance than you admit. Malcolm nodded slowly. "She used to tell me everything." "Maybe she still wants to," Lila said. "But she can't if you're always asking questions like traps." Inside, Avery cleaned up alone. She passed the hallway mirror and paused, seeing herself. And behind her, Malcolm on the porch with Lila. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there, watching. Then she turned out the kitchen light, leaving the room in darkness. And the silence stretched, pulling at every corner of the house. Malcolm felt it too. Not her presence, but the weight of everything left unsaid, and the boy asleep upstairs who might never know whose reflection he carried. The next morning began quietly. Malcolm awoke to the smell of coffee and the muffled sound of Silas's footsteps running down the hallway. The light in the room was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. He stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. He wondered what it would be like to live without the question, to believe without proof that everything was fine. But even the silence of the house didn't trust that fantasy. Downstairs, Lila was helping Silas with his backpack, laughing at a joke he made. Avery handed Malcolm his coffee with her usual soft smile, and for a second, everything looked like it used to. But he couldn't meet her eyes. Not fully. Jude hadn't responded to Malcolm's text since their last conversation. The distance felt deliberate. Later that day, while Lila and Silas were at the park, Malcolm walked through the house, stopping at rooms he rarely entered. In the guest room closet, tucked into an old suitcase, he found a notebook, Avery's. Inside were sketches, journal entries, and one short, dated paragraph written the week Silas was born. "I loved him, and I hated myself for it. But it ended. It had to. I made a choice, even if it haunts me forever." He sat with the notebook for a long time, unsure if the entry confirmed or confused him more. Who was him? Jude? Someone else? The words were raw, but vague, and they only deepened the ache in his chest. That evening, Lila returned with Silas just before the rain began. Malcolm watched them run up the porch, soaked and laughing. For a brief moment, he felt something almost like peace. But then Avery stepped outside to greet them, and all he could see was her standing in that mirror the night before, watching him with Lila. He pulled Lila aside later. "Why did you really stay this long?" She didn't flinch. "Because I saw what you were trying to carry alone." Malcolm looked at her, tired. "Do you think I'm crazy?" "No," she said. "I think you're scared, and maybe you should be." That night, Avery knocked gently on the door of the study. She sat across from Malcolm without speaking. Finally, she said, "I saw you and Lila on the porch." Malcolm closed his eyes. "It's not what you think. I didn't think anything, but it made me realize something." He looked at her. "I don't talk to you anymore," she said. "I talk around you. I used to tell you everything. I stopped because I thought you didn't want to know." "I wanted to protect myself," Malcolm said, "from the truth." Avery nodded. Maybe we were both doing that. They sat in that shared silence. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe recognition of how much had been lost by leaving things unsaid. Upstairs, Silas slept soundly, unaware of the cracks forming and healing in equal measure below him. And in the other room, the unopened DNA kit waited, as silent and dangerous as ever. Jude didn't come by that weekend. No texts, No excuses. Just absence, thick and deliberate. Malcolm tried to convince himself it was coincidence, that Jude had a life of his own, obligations, but the silence rang louder than any conversation could. Avery didn't mention it either. If she noticed Jude's absence, she kept it to herself. Lila, for once, didn't offer theories. She had started packing, planning her departure for the following week. Malcolm, restless, found himself walking into Silas's room one evening after his son had fallen asleep. He looked at the boy's face, peaceful, innocent, and tried to see only himself. But all he saw were layers, reflections of men he loved, men he feared he might resent. The next day, Malcolm took the DNA kit out of the drawer. He opened it, spread out the swabs, the instructions, the envelope. He sat at the desk for over an hour. Then he put it all back. At dinner, Avery broke the quiet. "Jude's not coming around anymore." Malcolm looked up. "You talked to him?" "I did. He said it's better this way, for all of us." "What does that mean?" "I think he knows how much you're hurting. Or how much I suspect." Avery didn't deny it. "He said he's sorry." The conversation died after that. But something lingered in the air. Not clarity, but something adjacent. A space where truth might live if they ever dared to speak it fully. That night, Malcolm took Silas outside to see the stars. They lay on the grass together, shoulder to shoulder. Silas pointed upward. "That one's mine," he said, choosing a star. Malcolm smiled. "Why that one?" "Because it's not the brightest, but it doesn't move. It just stays." Malcolm looked at him, eyes stinging. "That's a good reason." In the quiet that followed, he realized something simple and cruel. He might never know the truth. Not entirely. The people who held it, Jude, Avery, maybe even the plumber, had already said enough or too little. When Lila left 3 days later, she hugged Silas tightly. Then she turned to Malcolm and held his gaze longer than she needed to. "Don't wait forever to choose peace," she said. "I don't know what peace looks like," he replied. "Then make it look like love," she said, "even if you never get the rest." And with that, she was gone. Malcolm stood on the porch long after the car disappeared down the road, the envelope with the DNA kit still sealed in his pocket, and maybe always would be. Days passed. The house settled into a rhythm again, but it was quieter, not in sound, but in spirit. Malcolm found himself waking earlier, cooking breakfast more often, walking slower through the house, as if listening for something missing. Avery returned to her projects, rearranging shelves, organizing old photo albums. One afternoon, Malcolm found her staring at a picture of them on their wedding day. She didn't see him watching. Her eyes were dry, but distant. Later that week, Malcolm took Silas to a father-son event at school. They built a birdhouse together. Malcolm watched Silas handle the hammer with care, his brow furrowed in concentration. It reminded him so much of Jude or himself, he couldn't tell anymore. One of the other fathers asked, "He yours?" Malcolm looked up surprised. "Yeah, why?" The man shrugged, smiling. "Just looks like someone I used to know. Funny how kids carry echoes of everyone." That night, Malcolm sat alone in the living room, the DNA kit in his lap. He turned it over in his hands again and again. Finally, he whispered aloud, "What if I don't want the answer?" Avery came down the stairs. She didn't ask what he was holding. She sat beside him. "I saw Silas today," Malcolm said. "Like really saw him. And I thought, maybe it doesn't matter." Avery took a breath. "It matters, but maybe not in the way you think." He looked at her. "Do you love me?" "I never stopped," she said, "even when I was lost." They sat quietly, the weight between them no longer sharp, just heavy. Upstairs, Silas called out in his sleep, something about a dream. Malcolm went up and sat beside his bed. The boy stirred, then settled. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Malcolm thought about all the maybes. All the versions of truth he had built and destroyed in his head. Maybe the truth was out there, buried in the past. Or maybe the only truth that mattered now was the boy sleeping before him, and the man he chose to be, with or without answers. He kissed Silas on the forehead and whispered, "I'm your dad." "That's what I know." Autumn came quietly. Leaves rustled across Ridgeway Porch like small reminders of time passing, of seasons shifting regardless of inner storms. Life didn't stop. It softened. Malcolm found that the ache in his chest no longer screamed. It hummed. Silas grew more curious with each passing week. His questions ranged from constellations to why people fall out of love. Malcolm answered what he could and let silence hold the rest. One evening, Silas pointed to the sky. "Is there a star for everyone?" Malcolm nodded. "I think so." "What's yours?" Malcolm thought for a moment. "The one that never moves." The same answer Silas had once given. Inside, Avery began playing piano again, softly, almost shyly. Sometimes Malcolm would sit nearby, reading, just listening. They didn't revisit the conversation about the DNA test. It remained locked away, a secret neither had asked the other to open. Weeks later, Malcolm found himself at Jude's door. Not to accuse, not even to ask, just to look his brother in the eyes. Jude opened the door slowly, surprised. "Didn't expect you." "I know," Malcolm said. "I'm not here to dig up anything." They sat on the porch, much like they had as kids. The silence was easier than expected. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," Jude said eventually. "I believe you," Malcolm replied, "even if I don't know what it is." Jude sighed. "Then maybe that's enough." And maybe it was. That night, Malcolm returned home, kissed Avery without words, and sat by Silas as he slept. The boy stirred and mumbled something about his star. Malcolm smiled. In the quiet, he took the sealed DNA kit from his drawer and placed it in the back of the closet. Not out of fear, but choice. Some truths, he realized, are not answers. They're anchors. And he was done drifting. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and in a house filled with unspoken things, Malcolm finally found peace, not in certainty, but in belief. If this story moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every narrative invites you to look deeper, not just at others, but within yourself. Because sometimes what's left unsaid speaks louder than the truth.